Okay, I'm going to record this thing. Right, so the history of computing, we've got a number of things here that are shown on this first slide that give us an idea of that history, just a brief overview. The idea of an abacus, I don't know if you've ever seen this before. What would that be to do with computing? Well, we're using a machine, a tool to help us to do our calculation. And if you've seen anybody who's skilled in it, they can do it quite quickly, certainly a lot quicker than you would do it in your head or by counting your fingers or something. Slide rule. Now, this abacus it looks like here is about 3,000 years old. Slide rule, not that much old, like 400 years. And the slide rule was being used when I went to university in the 1970s. We were using slide rule to start with. Yeah, I certainly used it in high school. Slide rule is pretty good, especially if you had to do calculations that involved logs and stuff like that. We'd otherwise have to look up a log table. You could do it with the calculator. Of course, we don't do, with the slide rule. Of course, we don't do that anymore. Everybody has, well, you can do it with your mobile phone, right? Your mobile phone, you can do anything. If you haven't got, the phone comes with a basic calculator in it, but if you need an engineering calculator or a really special calculator, you can download an app, which will have whatever calculator you need. Babbage, so that's like 400 years ago, right? So the loom, oh yes, we will talk about the loom a bit too. The idea of a loom is kind of like punch cards. So the concept was something that became useful in computers later. Likewise, this fellow Babbage, he had a mechanical computer. So when we say a mechanical computer, if you look at the dates there, that's before people were using electricity in any way that was useful. I mean, the only electricity that they had before 1900 was the lightning struck and things got burned. That's about all they did for electricity. So there was a lot of inventions that happened at the end of the 19th century, which allowed for things like electric motors and generators and things like that. But Babbage was making a computer before that, and so they didn't have any electricity, and he was just using tumblers and things like that, sort of gears tumbling over each other. I think we've got some pictures of it that you'll see here later. Now in the 1900s, so you see here we've got these various computers that are mentioned, the ENIAC and the EDVAC. So that is after electricity was widespread. So it was a computer using electricity, but it wasn't using the electronics in the same way that we use them now. So instead of having a transistor, they had a thing called a vacuum tube. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. Maybe you have to go to a museum or something to see it. But if you looked at the original televisions and radios that people were using in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, they didn't have transistors in them. They had bulbs and the vacuum tubes, and the vacuum tubes got really hot. Well, imagine, yeah, it would be hard for you to imagine because we're just used to this, right? I mean, I know you can buy a smartphone that's got like a terabyte of storage available space on it. Amazing. Whereas these computers, the original ones that they were doing, we were talking about kilobytes if you're lucky. I mean, hardly any. But because every gateway, and computers are made up of lots of gateways. So a gateway is where you have a true or false. It's true or false, right? So open or closed. And so you can do that with electronics. And so we're able to put billions of gateways onto a silicon wafer chip cheaply. Okay, but the idea of the gateway, they had it with these computers. So that was a breakthrough. Gateway, true, false. Now we can do some computing with it. But the actual physical gateway was not very well developed. There's just a vacuum tube. So then we get the transistor. So what's the difference between transistor and the vacuum tube? Instead of using a big tube with vacuum in it, we have a very small transistor that could sort of fit onto just a little wire with a transistor inside. that miniaturization, so you see the dates there, 1947, that was very helpful because when they had the first space programs, they had to use a little bit of computing with them. You wouldn't have been able to do any computers with vacuum tubes. They used transistors for that. And of course, now in the more modern age, we got into silicon wafers. And silicon wafers, you can dope the wafer. When I say dope the wafer, you have a very almost pure silicon dioxide wafer. And on that, you can dope it with another metal oxide. It must be a semi-metal oxide, like germanium or arsenic or whatever. And in doing that, you have this idea of a semiconductor, and which provides you with gateways or in our silicon wafer chip. So because of that, now we have chips. We refer to them as chips, right? You have a chip that we will solder onto the motherboard, or maybe it'll be built into the motherboard, or maybe it's one that we can add to the motherboard. And those chips can do all kinds of things. It might be a processor chip, or it might be a chip that's used for storing data. And because of that, we have our sort of these. I'm hesitating to use the word modern computers because when you look at that computer, we thought it was pretty neat when these came out, like 1980 something, when the first Macintosh came out. We thought it was pretty neat because Steve Jobs, Steve Jobs didn't start out as a computer nerd. Steve Jobs started out as a sort of an arty nerd. You know what I mean? He was really interested in doing art and stuff like that. And so when he got with Wozniak, I think it was Wozniak he's with, who was the computer nerd, Steve Jobs was pushing to, let's make things look better. Let's have it a bit artistic. So it doesn't look ugly like that Microsoft stuff. and so they spent a lot of time sort of getting fonts together and stuff like that. And so they wanted this user interface, which was graphical, that would sort of catch people's imagination. And of course, Apple, they had some good times and some bad times. I mean, Steve Jobs was forced out of the company. The company almost went bankrupt. And then they made another company. And then he sort of came back and he had his ideas. And then he came back and he come back with a what? Came back with a tablet and an iPhone. And then boom, and then we're in the modern age, right? And so, yeah, I mean, it wasn't just technology. There were people that were probably doing even better technology than the Apple people, but he was making a product that people would like to feel and look at. And hey, look at that, scroll, gender, left, right, we can do all of these things that it makes it more real for people instead of just being sort of a techie thing. And really, computing 50 years ago, before we had people like Steve Jobs, computers were just for techie people. And we got techie people here. I mean, they're quite happy to not see anything on the screen, just typing codes, right? Script, they tend to work in hardware. Now we're in Linux or Unix, and if you like to think that way, that's really good. But nowadays you don't have to be. You could be a sort of an arty type nerd, and there's some computing for you as well. All right, so we got some terms here. The process of computing. I'm not sure that this thing is working because red light's on there. It said, it didn't give me a warning, so I'm hoping. So it says I'm recording, so okay. If you see it and there's no voice with it, you'll get my apologies. All right, so computing. The word precedes the modern age. I hope you got that by the first slide. In the first slide, you saw the abacus and you saw the slide rule. You could do computing with that. All right. Now, some of the people that nowadays we refer to as accountants, back 150 years ago, before there was the computers that we know, some people called them computers, right? Because they'd sit in the back room and they'd add up columns of numbers. So they were a computer, right? They're computing things. So yeah, it's a procedure of calculating. So I suppose a person could do that. But in computer science, and as it says here, it's a branch of engineering. where we look at doing computing processes and structures. Now, why is it a branch of engineering? Engineering is about building or making things, isn't it? You know, it's about or changing things, whatever. And so computer science now has become that very sort of physical thing. All right, so here we go, the abacus. There's some information about the abacus. I don't think that you need to worry too much about that. But having said that, all of these things might show up on a quiz. So there may be a quiz question, you know, which is what is about the abacus. What do we need to know about it? I guess, well, look, apparently it's been around since 2,500 years, it looks like. So the Greeks did a lot of great things. The Chinese definitely had one. So that's like 700 years ago or 800 years ago. And yeah, you probably may have even seen people doing this. So using a decimal number system, decimal where things are incremented by tens, hundreds, thousands, you can do your calculations with that, which is quite good. And now we got these machines. Now, what is interesting about all of these machines is, again, none of them are using electricity. There's no electronics, but it is used for computing. So as a result of that, we've got all these gears and things that are necessary, and kind of like how the abacus was working on the tens and things like that. Your gears would be working on increments of tens as well, I suppose. And yeah, you could do all kinds of things with that. And so there's one as long ago as 1643 by Pascaline. There's a computer language called Pascal. All right. So I guess this machine was named after that. Yeah, it's named after Blaise Pascal, who sort of, I guess he must have come up with that. Leibniz, on the other hand, so Leibniz was a German fellow. I don't know if any of you have heard of Leibniz before. Right, what I know about Leibniz is that both Leibniz and Pascal were mathematics people. All right, so Pascal was famous for some other things as well, but they're both famous for their mathematics. And in fact, Leibniz, I think Leibniz and Newton. Have you heard of Isaac Newton? He became Sir Isaac Newton. Just a little bit of interesting history. Maybe it's interesting. I don't know. It's to you. It's interesting to me. They had a pandemic, and I think it was about 1666, something like that. And they referred to it as a Great Plague in Europe. And as a result of that, so Newton, who was a young guy, he was studying, I think, at Cambridge University at that time, and they had a lockdown. They had a lockdown for 2 years because of a pandemic, and so he couldn't go into work. So during his lockdown, what did he do? Sat at home and decided to write some stuff and do some math, and he came up with his invention, which was the calculus. Did you guys study some calculus? Right. And so that was his contribution to his lockdown. And when he finished the lockdown, he's like, oh, here we go. This is what I did, the calculus. Leibniz did the same thing, but I don't think he was locked down. I can't remember which one of them published first, but they both published. I guess Newton probably published first because Newton's a name that we always think of. So, I mean, they both were able to sort of independently come up with this idea of calculus. And calculus is not really easy. So these are pretty smart guys. And so Leibniz, when he's not inventing calculus in a race with Newton, he's inventing machines to do mathematics. And so there you go. Now, Jacquard's loom, the idea there is this is sort of the industrialization of the United Kingdom. If you see the dates, where's the dates? Yeah, 1805. There's a lot of money to be made in textiles, you know, making cloth. And the way to do it was kind of slow. You had this loom thing, but you had this warp and this waft, whatever. And you had to sort of tamp the threads down and thread them through, tamp them down. And what he was able to do was be able to control that in a computer-like way using punch cards. So the punch cards, when the pins hit the cards, and then that would control the loom. to put the threads in the right place. So you could basically write a program with punch cards that would give you the pattern that you wanted in your cloth. So that's kind of cool. So wow, look at that, 200 years ago. And Charles Babbage, he came up with a difference engine. Again, this is a computer that was just all mechanical with wheels and gears and stuff like that. And first he had a difference engine, then he had an analytical engine, which was more general, as it says. Now we got a picture of it. Yeah, there they are. These are the two computers made by Babbage. Now, I think one of those, yes. So look at that. It says it was constructed in 1991, because the second one, Babbage never actually made it. He just did the engineering drawings for it. I said, you know, if we did this and we did this, we would come up with this thing which would do this computing. And he never actually made it. So some people at a university, I don't know where, but back in 1991, they took his drawings and they made the engine and they tested it out and it worked. You know, you could do all of these fancy mathematical calculations with it and it worked. So I think you can see it's got all kinds of sort of gears going on there. I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly what any one of those do, but you see that it doesn't have a motor or anything. It's got a crank handle. So you sort of set things up and you do a crank and out comes the answer, I suppose, which you probably read off the sides or something. Ada Lovelace. So she, I think, was related to Babbage. She took over from his idea, and she came up with what she's credited with being the person who invented the first computer programming language. Yeah. So she added to the notes that Babbage had. And actually, so there's a computer language that's named after. Okay, so necessity is the mother of invention. Have you ever heard of that? It's just an old saying, which basically, if there's a big enough problem, somebody will come along with a solution. Right? I mean, that's the idea of that. So there was a pretty big problem, which they had in the United States, which is the census. And the census was you'd go around to everybody's house and ask them who's there, how old are they, you know, a bunch of other questions. And then you'd take the answers to those questions and you'd collate them together. And then from that, you could do some planning. It's very important to people because, well, one of the reasons why it's important in the United States is because their political system is based on the census. So what that is, you know, if you got 350,000 people or something like that, you get to have a representative, you know, in the Congress. And so, you know, people want to know how many people there are. So, you know, do we get one representative or can we have two? Wouldn't that be better? You know what I mean? So we want to make a deal about how many people there are. But the problem was that they'd go out in 1880 or whatever, and they'd count everybody and ask them all these questions. It'd take them 10 years to collate all the answers. That was a problem, you know, getting the questions to get it into a usable form. So by the time they got it into a usable form, they're already up to the next census. And so that was the problem. How do we shorten that time? And so Hollerith came up with a punch card type idea, I think, which is, so he basically got his idea from the Jacquard loom, which was using a punch card. So he was using a punch card to represent numbers and things like that, so that he could put the raw information could be analyzed into something better. And so there you see the punch card that we're referring to, and that could be used in the census. So somebody could just enter details like that, and then we could read the cards in a more automatic way, just by basically, I guess you could see where light goes through the holes is some kind of information. And so you could have on a punch card the information you want. You can have a stack of punch cards, and you got a lot of information that you can analyze a lot quicker. First time I ever used a computer, we used to punch a card like this. After the punch cards, they had cards that you could use a graphite pencil with, and so on the pencil you just draw on the things, right? And so they would do that. And so that was definitely light, which was going on to the card. Actually, so you know how you guys are doing all the quizzes in D2L. or maybe you don't know because some of you guys are new. You haven't done this before, but we do our computer testing. You just sit onto the computer and do the testing. In the old days, so we're talking about 20 years ago, when we'd have a computer exam, what would happen is you have a piece of paper, you have a pencil, you put A, B, C, D, and then that would be graded by computer, and so they could just read it. That's kind of based on this idea here of like the punch card, you know, wherever that mark is, that can be sort of read. All right, so in this next slide here, the idea is we're getting into the electronic age, baby steps in the electronic age. But what we notice about those first computers, first place, this is happening after World War II or around the time of World War II. There's a lot of sort of that going on there. So they would be using computers. Obviously, as I said, they like to use them for the census. During wartime, they would use them for their weapons. And that was quite the use for them. But this is a very large machine, I think you'd say, right? That is a single computer. And that's one of these ones, the ASCC machine in 1947. And that would be full of not light bulbs, but vacuum tubes. But they would light up. And they use a lot of power. And they use so much power that when the computer was running, sometimes the lights would dim in the city, you know, in the little city where they were. It was quite a drain of electricity. There's the vacuum tube that I was referring to, right? So instead of little transistors that you're used to, or you know, a silicon wafer that's got billions of these on it, this great huge thing like this. And you know, you could plug them into the board. So that's gone, and now we have this. This is the chip that we're more used to. There's a little note there about GUI. GUI stands for Graphic User Interface. And I mentioned to you Steve Jobs and the Apple computers. They kind of pioneered that. Of course, Windows, everybody uses Graphic User Interface now. So Microsoft kind of copied the Apple idea for a Graphic User Interface when they came out with Windows 3.2. So this fellow, Alan Turing, you may have heard of his name associated with the thing that they call the Turing test. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before, but the Turing test, the idea is this is a test for artificial intelligence. If you can get a machine to interact with a human on some kind of difficult intellectual challenge, all right, so they're trying to work together or against each other in some intellectual challenge, and so that the person can't see the computer. But if you can do that, and the person is not able to identify that they're interacting with the computer, they think they're interacting with a human, then you kind of achieved sort of artificial intelligence, you know. So when we say that, the person must be free to respond in any way they want, right? So go off script and stuff like that. If they can do that and not figure out that there's a computer on the other side, supposedly that would be artificial intelligence. And I think we're getting kind of close to that now. Various people have come up with some sort of programs that they've used, and they have this Turing test regularly. All right, so why is it got his name? Well, he was kind of a tragic hero type person, I suppose you would say. But the German in World War II, the German submarines, this is the most interesting part of history to me, but you know, it might not be interesting to you, I don't know. So I'll keep it short. But the problem that the British had in World War II is they're a small island, and they were fighting an enemy that had occupied most of Europe. And so the British didn't have a lot of stuff that they needed to prosecute a war. So they didn't have food, they didn't have a lot of machines that they needed. And so where are they going to get them from? Well, Canada and the United States, they've sort of volunteered and said, well, we'll give you that stuff because we don't really want those Germans to win this war. So we'll give you lots of food, and we'll give you lots of weapons. The problem is that we've got to go across that ocean to get there. And the Germans didn't have a navy of any significance. They had a couple of warships, one was sunk pretty quickly, but they had a lot of what we call U-boats or submarines. And so they determined that the only way that they're going to sort of win this is they gotta starve the British out. And so when those boats go across there from the United States and Canada, they're going to sink them. And how they're going to do that is with their submarines, which they call U-boats. Now the thing is, what the submarines had on them is the Germans had a pretty good code. And so when I say code, cryptographic code, you know what I mean? So some of you might decide that you want to do cybersecurity, okay? And so they had a cyber code, and it was a pretty good one. And so the code was called the Enigma code, and they had a special machine that they could send information. So that's the way they communicated between the U-boats, the submarines, and back in Germany, right? So the way that submarines work is they can't defend themselves very well. And so they need to have it so that people don't know where they are. And so they would send out their, okay, there's a bunch of ships coming in this direction, and we'll send our U-boats there, and then we'll get those ships. And that would go between and so this was causing a big problem for the Canadians and the Americans and the British, because these ships were sinking. They're sinking a lot of them. Anyways, they were able to pick up the radio transmission of that code, but they couldn't understand it because it was cryptic. And so, where are they going to attack? We don't know. Anyways, Alan Turing made a machine which was able to they were able to put information in there and crack the code. And so fairly midway through the war, the British cracked the German code. And so after that, they knew where the submarines were, and kind of didn't go good for the submarines after that. But yeah, him and his people were able to do that. They had to build a machine to do it, and they had to get the information from the radio transmissions, and then they had to have, well, what can we get out of that information that we can start with as a place so that we can sort of crack this code. And what they noticed was at the end of every transmission, there was two things that were always the same. Every transmission had these two things all the same. They went, I know why. At the end of everything, they always say Heil Hitler. And so, okay, so that's Hitler. Okay, so we got 4 or 5 letters that we can sort of start cracking this code. Anyway, so that's just some history. Now, I said he was a tragic sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, he suicided. So that's tragic. He suicided. I mean, he wasn't your. If you're interested, why? I'm not going to tell you why. But I guess you could say he suffered from being bullied a bit. I mean, he wasn't accepted in his society because he had a kind of alternate lifestyle. I'm just going to leave it at that. All right, so that's Turing. ENIAC, we've got these guys here. They came up with some nice computers as well. And yeah, differential computers. I'm not going to say too much about them. To be honest, I'm not really sort of familiar, but what we've got is that they were doing ballistic trajectories. That is, that you're calculating where a missile will go, or where a bomb that you're sending from a gun will go. And so that would be quite good to have as computers. And yeah, so they would use that. No doubt that was because of the war. So a lot that we're talking about war because of that's the timing of the very first computers that we got there. I kind of said about this, I think already. Big computers, lots power, lots of heavy vacuum tubes using a lot of electricity. And then, yeah. So that was back in 1947. And since then, we've had a lot better computers now, I suppose. All right, so let's move on to this bit here. Here we've got this idea of fetch, decode, and execute. And I hope you can see these. Can you? So This is consistent with the Van Neumann architecture, which I mentioned at the start of the lesson. And so what we have is we have a device that has a central processing unit. Have you heard of these terms before at all? All right, so this is our computing architecture. Fetch, decode, execute. You see that we've got an arrow there. That would be a fetch, where we get some data, we fetch, and then we decode it in the CPU, and then we execute it. Okay, and so we use the memory unit as part of that, and later on we do the output. So fetch, decode, execute works with this Van Neumann architecture. Enough on that, I think. Okay. Oh, yeah. This is probably worth looking at as well. There. I mean, what we're looking at. You're looking at there the very early computer language. Okay, so we would call this not machine code, because machine code is just zeros and ones. But this very early computer language is the level above that, which we call assembly code, or some people just refer to it as assembler code. And so have a look at that. We got like 4 lines of code, and what do they do? Not very much. You know, we're going to add to R1. So there's an address here, address number 20, and this just says to add something to it. And then there's going to take that value and put that there. I mean, all we're doing here is we're taking 2 numbers and adding them together, right? You have to write like 4 lines of code to do that. So back in the day, it was kind of tricky. Yeah, so as it says there, Van Neumann, he came up with his architecture, which is sort of shown in the thing above. Important thing there is that we can use a binary number format. I don't know if you've heard of the binary number format. So binary just means bi means two numbers. The only 2 numbers is 0 and 1. And so that sort of represents the gates that we use one way or the other. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop there, because it's been about, not quite, but near to 40 minutes. And I see that people are a bit tired. And so let's stop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this meeting and